we are going to go ahead and get started. It looks like everybody is on. So, Sparkling Wine 101. Just a quick thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something new about sparkling wine. It's one of the, in my opinion, one of the best wines to drink for all occasions. If you would like to take notes, I would recommend just grabbing something to take notes with if you haven't already. I do have everyone's microphones muted. If you would like to ask verbal questions, you'll have to wait till the very end of the class. Otherwise, please just open up the chat function and type your questions into the chat function. This is a beginner class, so please feel free to ask any questions that come to your mind as I'm speaking. If I say something that doesn't make sense to you or you need a little bit more clarification on, please don't hesitate to ask the question. There are no stupid questions in my class. This is a live recorded class. This will go up onto the website within, 2 weeks or so. If you have the basic plan, you will have, actually, if you have any education plan, you will have access to the live recording of this class. It will be uploaded to the Wine Basics tab underneath the classes menu option. All right, so we are going to get started with sparkling winemaking methods. So there's quite a few different ways to make sparkling wine. The three most common methods you see here on the screen: the Moscato Method, also known as the Asti Method, the Tank Method, also known as the Charmat Method, Metodo Martinotti, Cuvée Clos, the Prosecco Method. There's tons of synonyms to each of these methods. And then the third most important method is, or most common method, is the traditional method. This is also known as Méthode Champenoise, Méthode Traditionnelle, Méthode Classico, or Cap Classique, as well as quite a few other names as well. These are just the most common names. There's also a fourth method, which we will talk about at the very end. It's just not a common method. So to break into the Moscato Method, the Moscato Method is the only sparkling wine method commonly used. There's exceptions to this rule, but commonly used, that only goes through one fermentation. There's not two. So what happens with the Moscato Method is we are going to start with ripe Moscato Bianco grapes. These grapes are found anywhere in the world. The Moscato Method doesn't have to be solely used in the Asti region of Italy. This can happen anywhere, but the Moscato Method is commonly used for Moscato Bianco grapes. So the grapes will be ripe, not underripe, not overripe. They'll just be perfectly ripe grapes. We're going to bring those ripe Moscato Bianco grapes into the winery, and we're going to press them as quickly as possible to get the juice away from the skin and to keep as little oxygen as possible touching the juice. Just like an apple or an avocado, when oxygen touches juice for clear juice or all juice, just like apples and avocados, it will start to turn brown. It will start to oxidize. So we want as little amount of oxygen touching the juice as possible. So we're going to press very, very quickly as soon as those grapes come into the winery. This is typically done at night or early in the morning when the temperatures are still nice and cold. Once we press that juice, we're going to pump that juice into a tank, and we are going to chill the tank down to very cold temperatures. It's not going to be freezing, but it'll be just above freezing. Cold enough that it's going to keep the yeast from being active. Yeast is how alcoholic fermentation begins. The yeast is going to consume sugar inside of the juice and convert that into alcohol. And we don't want them to do that with the Moscato Method, at least not right away. So if we chill the tank down to a very cold temperature, basically it puts the yeast to sleep. It doesn't kill them, it just puts them to sleep. It puts them into a hibernation. So the pressed juice is going to stay in this cold hibernation state until a distributor or a supplier reaches out to the winery and says, okay, we're ready for a full order. When that full order request is put in, they're going to warm that tank up. It's not going to be warm by any means. They're still going to keep it, at basically a refrigerated or just over a refrigerated temperature that you typically have for your fridge at home. And once that tank starts to warm up, the yeast is going to start to wake up. Once the yeast wakes up, they're going to start doing their job, which is to consume the sugar inside of that tank. What's going to happen is this tank has a lid on the top. We're going to start the fermentation with the lid open so the CO2 can start to blow off. Once we get to just a few degrees of alcohol inside of the tank, we're going to shut the tank and we are going to let fermentation continue with the tank closed, which means the CO2 is no longer going to blow off on the top of the tank. It's going to remain inside of the tank and thus create a sparkling wine. What happens when you have the tank closed is yeast needs oxygen to survive. And when you have too much carbon dioxide in the tank, the oxygen will no longer be the prevalent gas. So the yeast will start to basically die because they don't have oxygen to keep living. So because of that, fermentation doesn't finish to complete dryness. So when you taste Moscato, that sweetness in Moscato is not actually added to the tank. It is residual sugar from the grapes themselves that just wasn't converted into alcohol. That's why Moscato typically ranges between about 5 and 8% alcohol, because once you get that much CO2 in the tank, the yeast stop performing their job and they die. So you only get so much alcohol created and you have this lightly sparkling wine. Moscato is not a fully sparkling wine. This wouldn't make a fully sparkling wine with this method. There's just not enough CO2 being created because the yeast will suffer and they'll die. So this will be a relatively sweet, lightly sparkling wine. What happens now, or I kind of already went through that. So the fermentation begins. The yeast is going to consume all of the sugar. And again, the CO2 is going to be trapped inside of the tank. So at this point, we don't want to consume that yeast. We're going to filter the wine under pressure, and we're going to bottle the wine under pressure. This is all hand drawn, as you can probably tell. This last bottling line, basically what happens is there's still CO2 running through the lines. So you don't lose any CO2 as you're bottling and as you're filtering. Everything is still under pressure. So you don't lose any sparkling or any fizziness to your wine. So the Moscato method is the easiest method of making sparkling wine. Again, there is no sugar added at the end. The sugar that is still in the wine that you can perceivably taste is remaining sugar or residual sugar from the grapes themselves. That is the simplest, easiest way to make sparkling wine. This is typically done for grapes that are extremely aromatic and that have high levels of sugar. Moscato Bianco grapes are the most common grapes to be used for this method, which is why it's called the Moscato method. Any questions about the Moscato method before we go into the second most common method known as the tank method? All right, I'm not seeing any questions pop up. Again, feel free to ask questions as we go with this class. There are no stupid questions. I'm more than happy to make sure everybody is on the same page and feeling comfortable as we talk about each of these methods. All right, so the tank method. The tank method is commonly used for aromatic grape varieties that they want to showcase the aromas of the grapes. Typically, the tank method wines are not done for high sugar grapes because we're going to ferment these wines to dryness and then have the option of adding sugar at the end if we want to create a sweeter wine. So, with the tank method, we're going to bring in ripe aromatic grapes. If we're talking about Prosecco, these are going to be Glera grapes. I'm going to just use Prosecco as an example for right now because Prosecco is the most common wine used for the tank method or produced by the tank method. So, we're going to bring in our ripe aromatic grapes. We're going to press them very quickly, just like we did with our first method. We don't want oxygen to touch that juice. We want it to be as quick as possible. So we're going to press it very quickly, and that juice is then going to get pumped into a tank. That tank is going to be open, and our primary fermentation is going to begin, which is just our standard alcohol fermentation to create a still wine, meaning a wine without bubbles. So what happens is we have those grapes inside of the vat, or the juice rather, inside of the vat. We are going to add yeast and sugar to the tank once our first wine is created. So let me back up just a minute. I kind of skipped over that a little bit. So our primary fermentation, in case you didn't watch the turning grapes into wine method, primary fermentation is just standard alcoholic fermentation. Yeast is either going to be added to the vat or it's naturally occurring in the winery or from the grape skins. And that yeast is going to consume the sugar inside of the vat. Again, the vat is going to be open, so all of the CO2 is going to blow off, and the yeast is going to ferment the juice to dryness, meaning they're going to consume all of the sugar inside of that tank. Byproducts of this primary fermentation are heat, which we keep a cooled tank to make sure that heat doesn't spoil the wine. Flavors and aromas. So when you smell and taste flowers and apricots and peaches and things like that with your typical Prosecco wines that you consume, that's coming from the grapes as well as being created into more flavor and more aromas during the yeast fermentation stage. We're also going to have CO2 as a byproduct, which again is going to blow off because the tank is open for this first fermentation. Now that we have our base wine, which means our just still wine that has no sugar in it, we are going to add yeast and sugar to the tank. So we're going to add a little bit of sugar and we're going to add more yeast, and we are going to close the tank so the CO2 can no longer blow off. The yeast is going to consume the sugar that we just added to the tank, and it's going to convert that sugar into just a touch more alcohol, but it's not a lot of sugar to create a really high alcohol wine. It's just a little bit of sugar. The main purpose is to create CO2 inside of that tank. So our alcohol level will rise maybe 1 to 3 degrees. It's not much. But the primary focus or primary goal of this secondary fermentation is to create CO2 that is trapped inside of the tank, thus creating a sparkling wine. So primary fermentation is to create an alcoholic still wine. Secondary fermentation is to create a sparkling wine. Once this secondary fermentation is finished, the process of this is going to take maybe a week. We're then going to filter and bottle under pressure. We don't want to drink that yeast, so we're going to filter the yeast out, and then we're going to send it through a bottling line. Everything is done under pressure. to make sure that we don't lose any of that sparkle inside of the wine. There's an option to add sugar at this point if they want that wine to have perceptible levels of sugar to the taste, although it's commonly just left as is. There'll be just a touch of sugar. We'll get into the sugar levels and how much sugar equates to what the label is going to say when we get into our next method. Before I talk about the common places where this method is used, are there any questions about the tank method? This again is a pretty quick method. The Moscato method and the tank method are going to take basically a week to 2 weeks. It's very quick, very not labor intensive process, just to make a light, aromatic, easy drinking sparkling wine. Because these processes don't take a very long time, the wines that are produced with these methods tend to be less expensive because they're less labor intensive. I don't see any questions coming up. So our common places where we are going to see tank method sparkling wines produced, the one I mentioned most throughout the whole process is the Italian place called Prosecco. Prosecco is an actual place. It's a place within the northeastern area of Italy in that Veneto Friuli area. So Prosecco is a place, Glera is the grape. If Glera is made in the Prosecco region of Italy, they are allowed to put Prosecco on the label, just like champagne. It's a place, so you could only put Prosecco on the label if it comes from that place. The next really common place where tank method sparkling wines are produced is Germany. And in Germany, they label their tank method sparkling wines, really all of their sparkling wines, are labeled with the term Sekt. Sekt means sparkling wine in German. The last common, although we don't see it so much in the States, Lambrusco is produced in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. It's kind of the very center of Italy. Lambrusco is typically a sweeter style red sparkling wine. However, there are delicious dry examples, meaning no perceptible levels of sugar. So very, very commonly produced in Italy, in the Prosecco region, the Lambrusco region, and then very commonly produced in Germany, labeled as Sekt. There are some places in the New World that produce tank method sparkling wines, but they tend to be higher volume, not quite so quality focused styles of sparkling wine. All right, we're going to move into our third method of making sparkling wine, which is quite time consuming and quite laborious, and it's going to take the majority of our class. But before we move into that, I just want to give anybody an option to ask a question if you have it. Okay, so our third and our most common and the most time-consuming, the most laborious method, and in my opinion, the most delicious method of making sparkling wine is the traditional method. This is a method that Champagne made famous. It didn't originate in Champagne. It originated actually in southern France in a place called Limoux, which wine is still produced there in this method. However, Champagne really capitalized on this style of making sparkling wine and really made the reputation of the traditional method sparkling wines what it is today. So we are going to start by harvesting grapes. I'll use Champagne as an example here, but it doesn't have to be these grape varieties. when we bring in our grapes at harvest, in Champagne, the top 3 grapes that you are going to have come in for harvest are Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Meunier. And across the world, these 3 grape varieties are the most common grape varieties for traditional method sparkling wine. It doesn't mean there's not exceptions to that rule. There are tons of other grape varieties that can be made into sparkling wines with this method. It just happens to be that particularly Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are the most common used for making traditional method sparkling wine. So when we're making traditional method sparkling wine, we want to make sure that the grapes have a lot of acid in them because we want a lot of acid in the final wine. So we're going to harvest the grapes before they become fully ripe. When you are letting the grapes ripen on the vine, the riper the grapes get, the lower the acid levels are inside the grape itself. So to make sure that the acid levels are higher than the sugar levels in the grapes themselves, we are going to pick the grapes before they are fully ripe. Then we are going to make our base wine, which is known as vin clair. Most of these steps, you are going to see the French term for these. It's not something that you need to know at a beginner level by any means, but I'd like it to be on there so you understand if someone says the words going forward, you know what they're talking about. So making our base wine or our vin clair is our next step, which we talked about with the tank method. We're going to bring those grapes into the winery. We're going to press them very quickly. We're going to put them into a vessel. And I say vessel because not necessarily will it go into tank. Sometimes people use large oak barrels. Sometimes people use new oak barrels. It's very producer dependent. So that juice will go into a vessel that has an open top, and the primary fermentation will begin, which is when the yeast consumes all of the sugar inside of the vessel and converts that sugar into alcohol. This creates a very dry, there's going to be like no sugar whatsoever inside of these. On the screen there, you can actually see that that's my hand. I was in Champagne and I got to taste 3 different vin clairs, and it's the most acidic wine you will ever taste in your life. It's brutal to the palate, but it's what is necessary to make a really high quality, age-worthy sparkling wine. So our vin clair is a completely dry, still wine with extreme levels of acid. We're talking like in the pH between 2 and 3, which is like lemon juice level acid. From here, we are going to create a blend if the winemaker so chooses. And this stage is called the assemblage stage. So I'm just going to stick with Champagne as my example for this because it is the place that made it as what it is. So you can blend multiple grapes on the first screen here, or left side of the screen. You can see these again are the 3 most common grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier, used in Champagne production. If you don't blend Chardonnay with anything else, if you keep it on its own, you can bottle it as Blanc de Blanc. If you blend Pinot Noir and Meunier, or you don't blend them, you just bottle each of them as their own, you can label the wine Blanc de Noir. So white from black. Pinot Noir and Meunier are both black grape varieties. Chardonnay is a white grape variety. That doesn't mean this juice is going to be colored. The juice inside of both of these berries is actually clear. So more often than not, when a wine is labeled Blanc de Noir from Champagne, it's actually still clear or white. It is not a rosé or a red wine. The second option is you can blend vineyards. So there's over 300 different vineyards in Champagne, more so than that actually, but just to give you an idea. 300 is a pretty large number. You can blend different vineyards to have a different characteristic from each of those vineyards, create more complexity in a wine. The most common blending is a blending of vintages. So when you look at a bottle of sparkling wine, sometimes you will actually see a vintage on it, meaning the year. The year on the label means the year that the grapes were harvested, not the year that the wine was produced. So this, for instance, all of the grapes would have been picked in 2010. This is a little bit less common and definitely more expensive to make a wine that is purely of one vintage. So what is commonly done in Champagne is a blend of vintages. Typically, it's a blend of 3 vintages. However, there are producers that do way more than that. Veuve Clicquot, for instance, I think their minimum blend is 50 vintages, 50 different vintages. But 3 is going to be the most common. When you blend multiple vintages together, you are not allowed to put a vintage on the label. There won't be a vintage on the label at all. However, when you go into a wine store or into a restaurant, a lot of times you will see either NV or MV next to the price or the description or where the vintage would normally be. And NV means non-vintage, which is what Champagne, that is a blend of vintages, has been called for quite some time. However, some sommeliers like to be a little bit more correct in the way that they label their menus, and they will put MV for multi-vintage because it's not really non-vintage, it is a blend of multiple vintages, so they'll put MV. But in case you go into a shop or a restaurant, NV and MV mean the same exact thing. It's just meaning that the grape is not from one or the wine is not from one vintage. It is a blend of multiple vintages. So once we have created our blend and are ready to, we feel like that is where the wine needs to be, we are now going to make this into a sparkling wine. Again, we are going to go through a secondary fermentation. In the traditional method, this is known as prise de mousse. So prise de mousse is the secondary fermentation. What's going to happen is instead of in the tank method where we keep all of the wine in the tank and we add the yeast into the sugar into the tank, we are now going to bottle every single ounce of that tank into individual bottles. In that individual bottle, we are going to add sugar and we're going to add yeast. Within that bottle, secondary fermentation is going to occur because we're going to put a beer cap at the very end of the bottle. What's going to happen is inside of the bottle, every single bottle, the yeast is going to consume the sugar that we personally added. It's going to convert it into just a little bit more alcohol. Again, the point of this is not to raise the alcohol level, it's to create CO2 or carbon dioxide. So our alcohol levels will go up anywhere between 1 and 3 degrees, and we are going to create a sparkling wine. Now, it took quite some time for these bottles to become strong enough. One reason why that they're placed this way is if the bottle ends up blowing because there's too much pressure inside of the bottle, it's not going to destroy all the rest of the bottles. It will just stay isolated in its one little pocket of an area. You can see they're all basically neck to base for this entire length. This picture is in Champagne. It's in one of the top producers. And you can even see back here, there's caps right there as well. This is extremely deep. What's going to happen is they want a very large space for all of these wines to be placed, because in Champagne, the wine has to sit like this with the yeast in contact with the wine itself for at least a year, 12 months. The reason for that is once the yeast has consumed all of the sugar that we added inside of the bottle, the yeast is then going to go through a process called autolysis. And this is a process called Sur-Lie aging or Lees aging. All basically means the same thing. But what happens is once the yeast has consumed that sugar, it basically goes into a sugar coma and passes out. That sugar there's no sugar left inside of that bottle. That yeast that has basically gone into a sugar coma is now going to start breaking down. The process of this yeast breaking down is called autolysis. And during this process, the yeast, as it breaks down, is going to start releasing flavors into the wine. Those flavors are often referred to as brioche or biscuit or fresh bread or croissant or a nutty flavor. It's all this extra complexity that gets added to the wine. The reason why these really high-end champagnes end up costing so much money is in large part due to this step right here. Once you have created your wine, it now has to sit for at minimum 1 year before you can even touch it. Not very many businesses would do so well if that was the case for them. So because of the time and the labor that goes into this process, the wines end up costing more money. This is one of the reasons why the wines end up costing more money. There's quite a few. So during this process, typically the bottles are left completely flat because this way the yeast is going to lay on the bottom of the bottle and it's going to have the most contact with the most wine this way because it's going to be spread out across the bottom of the bottle. So we have our Sur-Lie aging that is designated by law in every region where these wines are made. However, in Champagne, the law there is this happens for a minimum of 1 year. Most producers, however, do this process for 3 years rather than just 1. From here, we don't want to drink the yeast inside of that bottle. So we are now going to go into our 6th step, which is called Riddling, or in French, remuage. So what's going to happen, this is me here. I definitely can't do this in 6 weeks, but somebody who's very talented and it's their job definitely could. There's 2 ways we get the lees down to the neck of the bottle. So you can see in these bottles here, there's actually lees sitting in the bottle. So there's no right or wrong, better or worse. If you do this by machine, this is called a gyro palette, or you do it by hand. This A frame right here is called a pupitre. So basically it's 2 slots that look like the letter A that have 60 holes in each side, and the neck goes into the hole. You can see the top of the bottle here, and the rest of the bottle sits out. Over the process of 6 weeks by hand, those bottles are going to go from completely horizontal all the way up to being vertical. The reason why this takes 6 weeks is the lees are really, really sticky. And so every single day for 6 weeks, a riddler is going to come in and basically, in a really rough way, it's just a very quick motion, move the bottle 1/8 of a turn. As they're moving the bottle 1/8 of a turn, they're slowly going to be moving it up as well. So it's going to go from horizontal all the way to vertical over the course of 6 weeks. This is done by hand every single day for 6 weeks. Not many producers still do this. It's typically only done for the top bottlings for the winery. Most traditional method sparkling wine is riddled by machine. So this machine is going to do the same exact thing. It's going to jar the bottles an eighth of a turn, or even more than that, every single day over the course of 1 week. So 6 weeks by hand, 1 week by machine. Again, all we're doing is moving the lees from the side of the bottle into the neck of the bottle. So there's no quality difference between doing either of these. This is just more time consuming, more laborious, and typically only the top wines are riddled this way. It shows just a little bit more, TLC going into the wine. It's just more hands-on. There's no machines touching it. So again, 1 week by machine. This machine is called a gyro pallet. 6 weeks by hand. This wooden frame is called a pupitre. So now that we have the lees into the neck of the bottle, again, the lees are the dead yeast cells. Now that we have the lees into the neck of the bottle, we don't want to drink the lees. We need to get the lees out. So our next step is called disgorging in English, or dégorgement in French. There's 2 ways to disgorge a bottle. These pictures I actually took. This is at Chateau-Taillé. This is Alex, who is the owner of Chateau-Taillé. We were tasting a bottle that he pulled straight from the pupitres. You can see here, this is actually just a one-sided pupitre. This isn't two-sided. And these wines can stay here as long as the winemaker so chooses. Again, 1 year is required by law, but some people prefer to do 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. 10 years is usually about the max that producers do, because flavors just aren't accumulating after about 10 years. So probably the easiest way, but the messiest way for sure, and the most wasteful way, is the traditional method of disgorging, which is called à la voilée, which you have this little tool in your hand that pops the beer cap off of the top of the bottle, and the lees shoot out along with a decent amount of wine. This was the way for a very long time until this machine was created. So this machine, you can see, has holes in it. The bottles are going to go upside down into this machine, neck down into the machine. And inside of the machine is a freezing brine solution, which is going to freeze the neck of the bottle. This basically creates a puck with the lees, and it's going to create less waste because you have the whole top of the bottle frozen. So this method is called à la glacée. We are going to freeze the neck of the bottle. There's going to be a lever on the very back side of this machine that's going to have a tool very similar to what Alex has in his hand here. And as the bottle gets raised out of the machine, it's slowly going to go from vertical back to horizontal. The bottle is going to basically hit the beer cap opener. The lees are going to fly into an area that's designated for it. So it flies out of the bottle. And then as the bottle is getting stood right back up, this is all done by machine, there's going to be a spout that fills up the bottle with a little bit of wine, possibly sugar, to top the bottle up from the space that was lost with the lees. And then it's going to be capped and corked and capped right away. So à la voilée, bit more time consuming, a little bit more wasteful, although it's very hands-on. There are some producers who still hand disgorge every single bottle of wine. And in this method, you can see there's maybe 10 or 12 slots. So you can do this very, very quickly and much, much more volume. The next process is the dosage process. So we are losing a little bit of space inside of that bottle when the lees are ejected from the bottle. With that space, we need to fill it back up to make sure that there is the volume of wine that is labeled on the bottle. If it's a 750 milliliter standard bottle, we want to make sure that is a complete 750 milliliters. So the process to fill up the bottle to the stated level or stated amount or stated volume is a process called dosage. Dosage is just dosage. There is no French term. We use a French term for our English description. So with dosage, we can fill up the bottle with just wine. If you fill up the bottle with just wine, you can put Brut 0 on the label. This could also say Brut Nature, no dosage, zero dosage. There's lots of different words that can be used or terms that can be used, but the most common is Brut 0. This means the wine is as dry as it gets. If there is any sugar, there can be a maximum 3 grams of sugar if it says Brut 0 on the label, but that is no sugar added. That is sugar that was remaining from the fermentation process itself. This is a very astringent, very linear, very acidic style of champagne that isn't produced by very many producers, but some producers like to focus on this style because it's really food friendly. It's a delicious style to have with shellfish, with meat, with basically anything. However, a lot of people don't tolerate this style without food. So it's not bottled by very many people, or if it is, it's just a very small amount of their production. The next level, you can add sugar at this level, but it's just a max of 6 grams per liter of sugar. And to give you an idea, I have lots of different cubes there, but 1 cube of sugar is about 4 grams per liter. So it basically would be a cube to a cube and a half equivalent of sugar being added to the bottle. If they have less than 6 grams per liter of sugar inside of that bottle, they can use the term extra brut. Now, brut is French for dry. So if you see brut on the label, it is going to be a drier style of champagne, meaning a less sweet style of champagne or traditional method sparkling wine. It doesn't have to come from champagne, just anywhere in the world that's making sparkling wine in this method. If you have 0 to 12 grams per liter of sugar, so this is up to 3 cubes of sugar per liter, you can label your sparkling wine brut. Brut is the most common labeling for sparkling wine, especially in champagne, because to offset that extreme amount of acid that is in the wine, champagne usually is around a 3.1, maybe 3.2 pH, which again, we're at, lemon juice, vinegar level of acidity. We need to offset that acidity for most people's palate to tolerate. And so brut is the most common because it's up to 12 grams per liter of sugar. Again, these don't taste sweet by any means. This would be adding, that would be equivalent of, let's see, max 3 teaspoons to roughly 34 ounces of water, or whatever you want to add it to. It's not enough sugar to really, really offset the sweetness. It's more the sugar is added to offset the intensity of the acid. So when you taste these, they're still going to taste pretty dry. And that's why they use the term brut for all of these levels. Again, brut is the French word for dry. Now it gets a little bit confusing because now we have the word dry in the label. And in French, dry does not actually mean in English dry. It means semi-sweet. So extra dry means that it's going to have a little bit of sweetness to it. This is between 12 and 17 grams per liter of sugar. A lot of Proseccos are labeled extra dry. Again, this is still not a really high amount of sugar. This is basically 4 cubes of sugar maximum, 3 to 4 cubes of sugar being added to a liter, which is about 34 ounces. Our next level is just dry, which is going to be between 17 and 32 grams of sugar. This is when we start really noticing that there is perceptible levels of sugar in the wine. It starts to taste a bit sweet. And again, dry doesn't mean dry. Dry in French means semi-sweet. Brut in French means dry. So it gets a little confusing with the French to English translation here. Then we have the level demi-sec, which is 32 to 50 grams per liter of sugar. If a Moscato were to add sugar to the bottle, a Moscato would be labeled demi-sec. But again, Moscato is residual sugar. It's not added sugar. So there's no sugar labelings on Moscato. Moscatos tend to be around 40 to 50 grams per liter of sugar, to give you an idea if you've had Moscato before. Then there is there's a final category, which is called doux. Doux can be anywhere over 50 grams per liter of sugar. So these are very, very sweet styles of champagne. I personally have never seen a bottle of doux. It's quite rare to be produced. Now, this process is done very, very fast. We do not want much oxygen to get into the wine, for one, and we don't want much CO2 to escape from the bottle, because we just went through all of this work to create a sparkling wine. So it's very, very fast, almost always done by machine. There are some people who still do this by hand, but it's very rare. Now we want to put the cork inside the bottle right away. We're going to put the cage over top of the cork. The cage is also known as a muselet. And that cage is going to hook underneath the lip of the bottle to make sure that cork stays inside of the bottle. So a standard bottle of traditional method sparkling wine is going to be anywhere between 5 and 6 atmospheres of pressure, which is about the same amount of pressure as a tire. So if you think about a tire blowing on the highway, all the damage that would be caused by that cork flying out of the bottle. So this muselet, or this cage, is put over top. It is linked under the lip of the bottle, and then it is twisted 6 times to make sure that this cork stays inside of the bottle. Then we're going to put foil over the top, and this foil is known as a capsule. There are many, many places in the world that commonly make traditional method sparkling wines. Again, Champagne is the region in France. Again, you cannot call a wine Champagne unless it's coming from that specific region in France, which is about an hour northeast of Paris. If it's coming from Champagne and it follows all of the rules of the region, it can be labeled as Champagne. In Italy, there is the same exact process, even the same grapes basically, that is used to make a really high-end style of sparkling wine. They actually have stricter rules in Italy than they do in France for this style of wine. And in this special place in Lombardy is called Franciacorta. Franciacorta is the Italian equivalent to Champagne. In Spain, this is going to happen just outside of Barcelona mainly. It can happen throughout the majority of Spain, but 90% of the production is going to happen just outside. It's basically just southwest of Barcelona. And it will be labeled as cava. So cava isn't a place. It's saying that the wine is made in the traditional method sparkling way. Typically, the wines are produced in a place called Pinedeth, which again is southwest of Barcelona in the Catalonia region of Spain. So we talked about champagne can only be labeled champagne if it comes from Champagne, France, but there's so many places in France that make the same exact style of wine, just not in the region. So if they are making traditional method sparkling wine in France, outside of Champagne, they will label their wine Cremant. In my opinion, Cremant is some of the most value-driven sparkling wines. They usually don't cost a ton of money, and they're almost always at Champagne level quality. They're really amazingly delicious examples out there. And then in the New World, the most common places are the US, most particularly Sonoma, Mendocino, and New York. There's exceptions to that rule. Oregon and Washington are making sparkling wines as well. They just don't quite have the reputation yet for it. South Africa, when we looked at that very first page, one of the synonyms for traditional method is Cap Classique. That is the South African term for sparkling wine made by the traditional method. And then also Australia and New Zealand. Australia, a lot of the wine is coming out of Tasmania. It's an island on the southern side of Australia. It's one of the furthest south growing regions in the entire world. However, there is a decent amount of sparkling wine coming from the mainland. And then also New Zealand as well. So before we talk about the last method and the method that's not very common, are there any questions about traditional method sparkling wine? All right, I'm not seeing anything come up. So our very last method, which is not a quality method, is the method of carbonation. The carbonation method is the equivalent of putting wine in a bottle and injecting CO2 in it. It'd be the equivalent of basically using a soda stream. I've actually thought about doing that. Maybe I should. I've got some wines that aren't, super drinkable. Maybe I'll just do that in the house just to see what it would do. But basically it's adding CO2 into a bottle of still wine to make it be a bubbly bottle of wine. This is not commonly used. I've actually never seen a bottle that is made this way. The places that would be doing this type of method would be the very high volume, not so much quality focused regions of the world. All right, I am going to unmute everyone in case anyone has questions that they'd like to ask out loud. Maybe I will. Okay, so I at least have it so you can unmute yourself now if you would like to ask a question just out loud if you don't want to type it into the chat. Just some last final things. If I see your little microphone unmute itself, I'll stop talking. Last few things. So I mentioned in the beginning, if you have an education plan, you will have access to watch the live recording of this class. So there are two education plans that you can choose from. The basic education plan is a limited access plan to the site. Excuse me, to the site. You have access to the grape guides, which is basically everything you could possibly want to know about the grapes that I have featured there. There will be more grapes to come. I'm just working on other parts of the site before I start adding more grapes. There's basic map resources, a glossary, the articles that are about current events of the wine industry, whether it's about our harvest this year or if it's about new wine laws coming up or articles that I have specifically written or things that I find interesting, I put it on there. tasting tools, uh, recommendations for great books and great websites to use to aid in your studies, as well as you will have access to the wine basics, which this class is a wine basics class, and the sake recorded classes. It takes me a week or two to upload the classes. They don't go up quickly by any means. You'll have to wait a little bit to view the class if you don't view it live with me. This is $10 a month that you can cancel anytime you'd like. Then we have the industry education plan, which is an all access plan for the site. You have all of the options for the basic plan, along with industry maps. There's about, I don't know, maybe 300 maps that I personally hand drew that are for the entire wine region. There's blank maps as well as labeled maps, and then some of them are my actual colored maps I used during my studies. There's a producer resources tab, which is basically my compilation of who I consider very classic producers for all of the classic regions to help in tasting as well as just learning more about producers. Vintage guides, I will actually be releasing the French vintage guides. I just finished them and I'm going through the edit stage, so I'll be releasing them likely next week, and we'll still be working on the rest of them. Study guides, these are to come. I created my own study guides when I was studying for the master's exam back in 2018, and so I need to go through and edit them and bring them all back up to speed. They're 2 years out of date now, so it's going to take a little bit of work. And then the industry education plan members will have access to all recorded classes. 2 additional things is if you have the basic education plan, you will get 25% off of every live class with your own unique code. With the industry education plan, you will get 50% off of all live classes with your own unique code. We have 3 more classes coming up this month. Next week, we have Business of Wine on Tuesday, which is basically all of the nitty gritty that sommeliers do that none of the movies and shows talk about. Viticulture focus session, this is getting kind of geeky with how to grow vines and how they change the way the wine tastes and why things are done differently in different regions and things along that line. It's not a beginner course, but it's not, you don't have to have a prerequisite to join into the class. Then we have a vinification focus session, which is a geeky winemaking class, basically. It's going to talk about so many options that winemakers have to create a different style of wine, different complexities. We'll talk about carbonic and whole cluster and stem inclusion and all of these things in that class. Again, not a beginner level, but there's no prerequisites to join the class. So I'm going to give you one more option. We're just on time here, but I have a few minutes for you. If anybody has any questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I will let you get on to your day. I hope you learned something today. I'm not seeing anything come up, so I think you guys are all good. I hope you had a good time today. I hope you enjoyed the class. I hope you learned something. Go drink some sparkling wine, go enjoy it. And if you do end up having any questions, feel free to just reach out to me by email. You can just use the contact option on the site itself, and you can send me an email if you have any questions in the future. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week.